And so that brings me nicely to the new book, Under Fire, Black Britain in Wartime, 1939 to 45, which again, like Black Poppies, tells the stories of Black people on the home front, Black people in the armed services. And on the home front, somebody asked me the other day, who is your history hero? Like, and it has to be Howard Moody, Dr. Howard Moody, who was a Jamaican doctor, a GP in Peckham, and founded with George Roberts the League of Coloured Peoples in 1931. So this was one of the first Black-led organisations in this country. But when the war broke out, Howard was established. He was known to the Colonial Office, he was known to the government, people high up in office, and he was absolutely incensed when his son, Charles Joe Moody, he was known as Joe, was refused a commission, or refused the opportunity to become an officer in the British Army. The whole situation with Walter Tull and others in the First World War had been completely forgotten, but Charles was turned down. So Dr. Moody, his father, fought that particular colour bar, as it was called. And the British Army and the government, the military said, well, we'll lift the ban on recruits from non-European backgrounds or non-European descent for the duration of the war. But Moody said, no, we want it for the whole of the war. So that story is covered, and many others, in the new book, Under Fire, which again includes a lot of first-hand testimony. And this comes to what I said earlier about meeting and befriending some of the amazing men and women that joined the armed services in the Second World War. And one of them was Lillian Barder, who I first met way back in 1991. She lived to be, I think she was 97 when she passed away a few years ago. But we remained in touch, and she was from Liverpool. She was the daughter of Marcus Bailey, the sailor in the photograph I showed you earlier. And she was born in Liverpool in 1918, wanted to do her bit for the Second World War, and join the WAFs, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. So she was in the Women's Air Force from 1941, married a Black British soldier, Ramsay Barder, in 1943. This is their wedding photo. And Ramsay was at the D-Day landings in 1944. But Lillian, like so many, always regretted that the contribution of Black Britons and Caribbeans and Africans to the Second World War was constantly overlooked. It took many years for the West Indian Ex-Services Association campaigning to be allowed even to march at the Cenotaph every November. Extraordinary. But Lillian was one of the many that I met and befriended and was very honoured to. I never met Ulrich Cross, but Ulrich Cross is in the new book Under Fire, and he was from Trinidad. As a young lad, he wrote in his book at school that he wanted to be a flying officer in the RAF. And again, there was a colour bar, what they called a colour bar in the Royal Air Force at the beginning of the war, which again Howard Moody helped to get lifted. So Black men from the colonies were barred from joining the RAF until 1941. The bar was lifted in 1940, partly because of the decimation of the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain of 1940. But the first recruits didn't start to come to this country, and Ulrich was one of the first from the Caribbean, that is, and Africa. Peter Thomas was the first Nigerian to join the RAF in March 1941. Ulrich joined also in 1941. And when Under Fire was covered in this book, Britain at War has been published for some years now. But to my knowledge, and in my experience, this is the first time a British war magazine, and there are many, has put a Black serviceman on the cover. So it's quite a breakthrough. And this was in the October issue, the last October, just gone issue. And Ulrich was one of the most highly decorated black servicemen in the Second World War. He received the DFC and the DSC from the King George VI at Buckingham Palace. And this is a photograph of him at Buckingham Palace after he had received these honours in 1945 at the end of the war. And he survived where so many didn't. One of the kind of sad stories in Under Fire is the fact that I have to cover those that, so I'm just trying to get the book, those that lost their lives. And when I found this wonderful picture of, wow, sorry, time for glasses, of Sergeant Dickinson from Canada and Sergeant Leslie Gilkes from Trinidad. If you can see in the book, they're there. It's a lovely picture of, again, friendship and comradeship. People had to get on in the war. And tragically, Sergeant Gilk was killed in action shortly after this photograph was taken. He was shot down in his plane over Germany. And there are many, many other stories in the book, which I'm sure you will find fascinating. Princess Ademola from Nigeria, who was a nurse. This is before the NHS. She actually came to Britain in 1938 and trained as a nurse at Guy's Hospital. There's Leary Constantine, cricketer from Trinidad, who became a welfare officer during the war, with Una Marson, a Jamaican feminist, who had hosted and produced her own BBC radio series called In the West Indies, and that's a photograph from that. So there are many, many, many people, and these, to get back to education and schools, I know there is a big drive on at the moment to get Black British history taught in schools, but it is a huge, massive subject. And I assume most of you calling in this afternoon are teachers and probably teach history. I do feel for you, because this is a massive subject. It's not, and how you teach it is going to be difficult because of the wealth of information. But my advice would be, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to talk about racism, but don't be afraid to talk about friendship as well. Using, if you like, some of the examples that I've given, because it is very, as I say, empowering. I use that word for young people from all backgrounds to hear that, as I say, not all white people were racist, not all Black people saw themselves as victims. And that is part of the mix, that is part of the story as well. I'll end there because I've covered quite a lot of ground. I mean, I wish I could say more, but I've given you hopefully an insight into the kind of work that I've been pursuing all these years.